Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're doing part 3 of the Napoleon series. We're going to watch Napoleon basically bounce Prussia out of this thing. And one of the comments that I got about Napoleon and specifically the power that the French army had was their relative manpower compared to everybody else in Europe. And this is completely true. The big Probably the biggest factor for the French army at this point, as good of a general as Napoleon was their manpower. They were conscripting the masses because they were this new republic for and by the people, quote unquote. They were able to basically just bring in the masses into the military. Well, the rest of the European powers wanted nothing to do with that. They wanted no part in arming and training the people that they had under them, that they were always scared to death were going to rise up and overthrow them. They could think of nothing more terrifying than having an armed and trained civilian populace. So it's a huge, huge advantage for the French army at this point, and they're going to show the historical land power right now for Europe is Prussia. Prussia is known as having this great military tactics, military hierarchy, and Napoleon is going to come in and basically just sweep them out of this conflict. So, with that being said, let's get into it.
An Epic History TV History March collaboration, supported by our sponsor, The Great Courses Plus. In December 1805, at the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, won a crushing victory against the joint forces of Austria and Russia. Napoleon now dominated Europe, able to hand out spoils as he saw fit. In February 1806, he sent an army led by Marshal Massena to overthrow the King of Naples, who had dared to side with his enemies, and gave his throne to his own brother Joseph instead. Another brother, Louis, was made King of Holland. His German allies, Bavaria and Württemberg, were elevated to the status of kingdoms.
And interestingly, this is seen as like spreading revolutionary ideals, even though Napoleon is basically just going in and putting in a new monarch at the head of each of these. He's going to start the German states here, and he's actually going to get a lot of manpower for the military for that. But this is France, quote unquote, spreading revolutionary ideals throughout Europe, even though that's not really what they're doing.
While Napoleon made himself protector of the Confederation of the Rhine, a new alliance of German states that would contribute 60,000 troops to his army. In recognition of the new reality, Emperor Francis of Austria formally dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, founded by Charlemagne 1,000 years before, but now without influence or purpose. Austria had been humiliated. France remained at war with Britain, Sweden and Russia. But in the summer of 1806, all eyes were on Prussia. The Prussian king, Frederick William III, regarded Napoleon with deep mistrust and had been about to join the coalition against him when news arrived of its disastrous defeat at Austerlitz. He was heavily influenced by his wife, the celebrated and popular Queen Louise, who detested
Frederick William III is definitely a far stretch from the days of Frederick the Great in Prussia.
France and Napoleon. She led the influential War Party at the Prussian court. Matters came to a head over Hanover, a German state which had belonged to British King George III, been occupied by the French, and given by Napoleon to Prussia as compensation for other territorial changes. Now the Prussians learned that Napoleon had secretly offered to give Hanover back to Britain in exchange for peace. Frederick's advisors now persuaded him that war was the only honourable course. But Prussia then made a basic strategic blunder, sending an ultimatum to Napoleon without consulting its new allies in the Fourth Coalition. Their forces were too far away to help Prussia, who would now face Napoleon's Grande Armée with just the small state of Saxony for support.
Clausewitz writes the layout of war for Europe and the Prussian army. I've had to read a lot of Clausewitz for a military history class. His writings are awesome in understanding the intricacies of the armies of this time.
In 1806, the Prussian army had a fearsome reputation that dated back 50 years to the reign of Frederick the Great. Napoleon, a student of history, regarded it with respect. But Prussia's army had been allowed to rest on its laurels. Its generals were old, its staff work hindered by bureaucracy and personal rivalries, its movements ponderous and predictable. Prussian soldiers, however, could be relied on to fight with pride and determination, while Prussian cavalry was regarded as amongst the best in Europe. In October 1806, Napoleon invaded Saxony with an army of 166,000 men and 256 guns. Advancing in 3 columns, the French crossed the mountain forests of the Thüringer Wald, along roads carefully reconnoitred by scouts and spies. Napoleon intended to threaten Leipzig and force a decisive battle with the Prussian army, which he believed was near Gera. The Prussians were, in fact, further west, concentrating near Erfurt, on the west bank of the river Saale. Its commander, the Duke of Brunswick, had hoped to threaten the flank of Napoleon's advance. But wrong-footed by the speed of the French, he now ordered a retreat north to find a new defensive line. On the 10th of October, at Saalfeld, Marshal Lannes' 5 Corps clashed with a Prussian advance guard, commanded by Prince Louis Frederick, the king's cousin. The Prussian force was routed, and Prince Louis himself killed in combat with a quartermaster of the French 10th Hussars. 3 days later, Lannes made contact with a large Prussian force near Jena and sent news to Napoleon. The French emperor, believing he'd found the main Prussian army, rapidly issued orders for his corps to concentrate for battle at Jena. Bernadotte's 1 Corps and Davout's 3 Corps were to cross the Saale and fall on the Prussian flank from the north. But Napoleon was wrong. Lannes faced a 35,000-strong Prussian rearguard, commanded by General Hohenlohe. The main Prussian army, 52,000 men under the Duke of Brunswick, was further north, moving straight into the path of Davout's 3 Corps.
And this is an extremely dangerous situation here for Napoleon. Basically, his plan is to wrap around with 3 Corps and go down and hit from the flank this Prussian army. However, that exact plan can go opposite if the Prussians wipe the corps out and then sweep down on the field from the north, just like the French were going to do. So this is a very precarious situation at this moment.
The Battle of Jena began at 6:30 a.m. on the 14th of October. in thick fog. Marshal Lannes' 5 Corps already had a toehold on the plateau west of the town and river. His first task was to drive back the Prussians and win room for the rest of the French army, arriving by the hour to deploy. His infantry led the way, and fierce fighting broke out for the villages of Cospeda, Klosewitz and Lützeroda. Meanwhile, Augereau's 7 Corps advanced through a ravine, emerging onto the plateau on Lannes' left flank, while Soult's 4 Corps climbed steep tracks to form on his right. Napoleon joined Lannes in the centre of the battlefield, organising a 25-gun battery to support the attack on Vierzehnheiligen. The village was won, but then lost to a determined Prussian counterattack. On the right, around 10 a.m., Soult's infantry secured Klosewitz, but was counterattacked on its right flank near Rödigen. A decisive charge by Soult's light cavalry drove off the Prussians, routing their infantry and capturing 2 enemy colours. As 6 Corps began to arrive on the plateau, its fearless but impetuous commander, Marshal Ney, ignored orders and dived into the fighting around Vierzehnheiligen, becoming briefly cut off by a Prussian counterattack and having to be rescued by Guard cavalry. General Hohenlohe was expecting the arrival of 15,000 more troops under General Ruchel at any moment. Until then, he remained largely inactive, shoring up his line and ordering limited counterattacks. But he had run out of time. Napoleon had begun the day with just 25,000 men. By 12:30, a steady stream of reinforcements had brought his strength up to 96,000. As the Emperor rode past the Imperial Guard, one young soldier, eager to be sent into action, called out, "Forward!" Napoleon stopped and demanded to know who had spoken, then rebuked the soldier as a beardless youth who ought not to offer advice until he too had commanded in 30 battles. But the moment had arrived. Although the Guard, to its frustration, remained in reserve, the other French corps were ordered forward in a general attack. The Prussian army began to give ground. At first it kept its discipline, but then disintegrated into a general rout. Murat's cavalry were launched in pursuit, riding down and sabring hundreds of fleeing Prussians.
Again, this is still in the time period where when a line breaks, cavalry is extremely effective in essentially decimating that routing army. You know, to time immemorial before this, cavalry charges at the end of battles have been extremely effective at that. It's not going to be effective for too much longer here. Once you get to World War I, you know, the whole thing was cavalry charges had worked for forever. And then you get to World War I and cavalry charges get your cavalry completely slaughtered by machine guns. But at this point, cavalry still works. Napoleon was really good at deploying that cavalry. And so he used the artillery and the infantry to go in, bust holes in the line, cause a rout, and then would send in the cavalry to just sweep down the routing enemy. The Prussians have a force here coming in, but it's not going to be in time.
General Ruchel's 2 divisions finally arrived at the worst possible moment. They briefly held up 5 Corps' advance, but were soon outflanked, broken up by cannon fire, and charged down by French cuirassiers. Meanwhile, 12 miles to the north, near Auerstedt, Marshal Davout was marching southwest, expecting to fall on the Prussian left wing at Jena. Instead, he encountered the Duke of Brunswick's main Prussian army, heading north to take up new positions. Davout's 3 Corps, 27,000 men and 48 guns, was about to face odds of 2 to 1, while Bernadotte's 1 Corps, which had orders to support Davout, was nowhere to be seen. Davout, nicknamed the Iron Marshal, showed no signs of alarm. He formed his 1st Division into a defensive line centred on the village of Hassenhausen, his infantry forming squares to repel a series of cavalry charges by General Blücher's advance guard. His other 2 infantry divisions arrived to strengthen the line, standing firm in the face of repeated Prussian attacks. But Prussian movements were slow and poorly coordinated, nor did they use their numerical advantage to try and outflank Davout. At a crucial moment, the Duke of Brunswick was shot through the eyes, a wound that proved fatal. King Frederick William himself took command. Several Prussian units remained uncommitted, but the king, convinced he faced the main French army under Napoleon, dithered. Around 12:15, Marshal Davout counterattacked. The Prussian army turned and fled. Davout had won a stunning victory against the odds, but at a heavy price. His corps suffered 25% casualties.
And so you can see the differences here. Napoleon, who uses the artillery extremely well in these battles, can basically just beat and beat and beat on one of these corps or one of these groups that's holding out in a village or holding a line, and essentially they will wear them down enough to where they will flank them, they will push them out, and then they'll send the cavalry in. You see how much of a difference good generalship makes, because here they have artillery with them, they have the numerical advantage, but because they don't have the tactics, they don't have the I guess sense to handle a battle of this magnitude, even though this is a way smaller French force that they're fighting than the regular French army, then they end up routed again by a smaller force. That's how big of a difference good generalship can make in the outcomes of these battles.
1 man in 4 killed or wounded, while inflicting twice as many losses on the Prussians. When news reached Napoleon that Marshal Davout had engaged and defeated the main Prussian army, he reacted first with disbelief, then heaped praise upon the Iron Marshal, later awarding him the title Duke of Auerstedt. Marshal Bernadotte, in contrast, was nearly court-martialed for failing to support Davout. Napoleon's army began a masterful pursuit of the beaten Prussians, giving them no time to regather their strength. 2 weeks after the twin battles of Jena-Auerstedt, Napoleon's troops, led by Davout's heroic 3 Corps, entered Berlin. The next day, General Hohenlohe surrendered at Prenzlau. At Lübeck, General Blücher and 20,000 Prussians were driven out of the city in heavy fighting and forced to surrender, while 25,000 Prussians besieged at Magdeburg surrendered to Marshal Ney.
It's so crazy to me how different warfare becomes after this point. This is still considered I've heard the quote, gentleman's warfare, and that's really kind of what it is. You have this idea that, like, as brutal and bloody as these conflicts can be, it's still basically, a little bit of territory here, a little bit of territory here, Maybe you swap out rulers in this place or that place, but more or less, all of these states kind of go back to the way they were pre-war, where, as you all know, later in history, if you're this far into Prussia, you just take Prussia. Like, there is no treaty or any, like, you just take it. And then once you've taken all of Prussia, then you can sit down and negotiate. And basically, you could say, okay, well, you can have half the land back, but we're going to keep half of it. You can basically do whatever you want. But it's bizarre to me how you have this time period where it's just about beating the army. And then once you beat the army, you're like, okay, well, then we'll sit down and we'll negotiate terms. But there really is no inclination to just go in and take everything. And which is obvious in the Napoleonic Wars, because they could have taken Austria a dozen times during the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, they could have taken Austria over and over and over and over again. But they don't. They don't. They take some territory here and there. They do some different things, but they never fully like annex Austria or take over the whole thing militarily and then make them sit down basically with a gun to the head to sign the negotiations. It's just a very different type of warfare than you see in a lot of history before and after this point.
Prussia's army had been devastated by a Napoleonic blitzkrieg. In just 33 days, Prussia had lost 20,000 dead, 140,000 prisoners, 800 guns, and 250 standards. It was a humiliation that proud Prussians like General Blücher would neither forget nor forgive. Unlike Saxony, King Frederick William refused to make peace with Napoleon. He continued to hold out in East Prussia, trusting in the approaching Russian armies to rescue his kingdom.
Good luck with that.
Despite another glorious victory for Napoleon and the Grande Armée, the war was not won yet. Napoleon Bonaparte was one of the greatest military commanders of all time. But who were some of the worst? Find out with the Great Courses.
Okay, so that was the third Napoleon video. Yeah, that was a really good one. I'll get to the next one probably tomorrow. But like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.